Why land access has become one of the most underestimated risks in international operations. Ask most executives to list the top risks in their international portfolio, and you will hear familiar answers: currency volatility, political instability, regulatory exposure, supply chain fragility. These are the risks that have been stress tested, modeled, and built into planning frameworks over decades. What is less likely to appear on that list, and what is increasingly showing up in ways that are difficult to absorb after the fact, is the physical environment itself. According to the World Bank, land access, environmental liability tied to site conditions, and the growing intersection of both with water availability are becoming material constraints for international operations. They are not emerging risks sitting on a horizon. For many executives, they are already inside current capital commitments and development pipelines. What has actually changed about land access? Securing land for industrial development in international markets has always involved navigating local complexity. What is different now is the weight of environmental regulations sitting on top of that complexity, and how quickly that weight is increasing across markets that were once considered relatively open. In the European Union, the nature restoration law that came into force in 2024 introduced obligations tied to land ecosystems that go well beyond what most operational planning teams had built into their development assumptions. The law creates requirements around restoring degraded ecosystems and protecting biodiverse land that directly affect how industrial sites can be developed, expanded, or repurposed across member states. For companies with existing European footprints or active development plans in the region, this is a material change to the planning environment, not a future consideration to flag and revisit. In Southeast Asia and Latin America, agricultural land conversion restrictions have tightened considerably in response to deforestation commitments and domestic food security pressures. Industrial development pipelines that were structured around greenfield land assumptions are running into restrictions that simply were not in place when those plans were originally written. The gap between what was assumed at the planning stage and what is now permissible is creating real project delays and, in some cases, fundamental rethinks of site strategy. Across emerging markets more broadly, land rights complexity has always warranted due diligence attention. What has elevated it is the combination of international investor scrutiny, growing community opposition to industrial land use, and an expanding body of legal frameworks that create long-tail liability for companies that did not secure land rights carefully at the outset of a commitment. Legacy land liability is getting more expensive, not less contaminated. Land liability is a known issue for international industrial operators. What is less well understood is how the cost curve on that liability is moving. In Europe, legacy industrial sites carry remediation obligations that are becoming harder to defer. Regulatory bodies across Germany, the Netherlands, and increasingly in Central and Eastern Europe are pushing for faster cleanup timelines on sites that have carried unresolved contamination for years. The option to manage these liabilities slowly and quietly is narrowing. In parts of Asia, particularly in markets where industrial development moved faster than environmental regulation could keep pace, companies are now managing legacy contamination alongside tightening national standards that were not in place when original development occurred. The liability calculation for those sites today is fundamentally different from what it was 10 years ago, and the trajectory suggests it will be more demanding still in the years ahead. For executives overseeing international portfolios, the practical implication is straightforward. Environmental due diligence on land needs to include not just the current regulatory picture, but a realistic assessment of where that picture is heading. A site that clears current standards in a market with a rapidly tightening regulatory environment is a different asset than its current compliance status suggests. Water compounds the picture in the markets that matter most. Land and water constraints are not separate issues for international operations. In many of the markets where land access is becoming more complicated, water availability is adding a second layer of pressure on the same decisions. The regions where industrial growth has been most attractive over the past decade often happen to be the regions where both land restrictions and water stress are now tightening simultaneously. The UN's 2023 World Water Development Report projected that global water demand will exceed supply by 40% by 2030. For executives making capital commitments in water stressed regions, that is not a macro statistic. It is a site level constraint that affects permitting, operational continuity, and the long term economics of assets that were evaluated under different assumptions. The World Resources Institute's Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas maps water stress at the facility level globally and is increasingly referenced by insurers and investors when evaluating physical risk in international portfolios. If your leadership team has not reviewed your own footprint against that data, it is worth doing before the next capital conversation rather than after. The supply chain dimension executives are underweighting. The land and environmental risk picture for international operations does not stop at your own facilities. Suppliers operating in environmentally constrained regions face rising costs, production limitations, and regulatory pressure that do not stay contained within their own operations. They move upstream. A 2024 report from CDP found that companies report environmental risks in their supply chains at rates significantly higher than the risks they report in their own direct operations. For executives with global sourcing structures, that gap is real exposure. The companies that are building land and environmental risk into supplier due diligence and sourcing decisions are getting ahead of disruptions that others will be explaining after the fact. What leadership teams need to have visibility into. The executives managing physical environmental risk well have made a deliberate decision to bring it into the same strategic framework as regulatory and financial risk. That means it shows up in capital planning, site selection, due diligence processes, and supply chain decisions, rather than sitting in a sustainability function with limited connection to operational strategy. Facility and site-level environmental risk mapping is increasingly expected by investors and insurers. Companies that cannot produce a clear picture of their physical environmental exposure at the asset level will find that gap surfacing in capital raise processes and in coverage conversations with underwriters who are paying closer attention than they were 2 years ago. Tracking regulatory direction by market, rather than just current standards, matters more now than it used to. And at the supply chain level, extending environmental risk visibility beyond first-tier suppliers is a structural response to a gap that CDP research has made difficult to ignore. The strategic reality, land access has become one of the most underestimated risks in international operations precisely because it does not announce itself the way financial or regulatory risks do. It surfaces gradually in project delays, in due diligence surprises, in supply chain disruptions, and in capital commitments that looked sound when they were made and look different as conditions evolve. The executives who treat it as a strategic variable rather than a background consideration are in a better position. Not because they have eliminated the risk, but because they are managing it deliberately rather than discovering it under pressure. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.